It's astounding how far people can go. A mother, who is supposed to love and protect, can also be capable of plotting her own daughter's death. A dangerous love triangle involving a mother-in-law, son-in-law, and daughter could not end well, and indeed, it didn't. Today, we will talk about the case of Jéssica Carline, who unfortunately lost her life in a totally brutal and cruel way at just 22 years old. A young, beautiful, lively, and happy girl, that's who Jéssica Carline Ananias da Costa was. She was only 15 when she began a relationship with Bruno José da Costa, who was 19 at the time. In less than a year, she became pregnant from this relationship. Due to the pregnancy, they got married, and Jéssica's mother, Célia 40, offered them a house in Apucarana, Paraná, Brazil to live in. This house, where Jéssica lived, was next to her mother's house, making the proximity between daughter, son-in-law, and granddaughter more frequent. The year was 2009 when things started to take a completely different turn. After giving birth to her daughter, Jéssica started working at a supermarket, and her daughter was under the care of her mother. Bruno began studying law at the same time. Célia became an even more frequent visitor to her daughter's house. However, what seemed normal, a mother helping her daughter and taking care of her granddaughter, soon turned into an attraction between mother-in-law and son-in-law. Exchanges of glances began to happen, and Célia, according to witnesses, started dressing in more provocative clothes, apparently with the real intention of getting someone's attention. Shamelessly, the son-in-law and mother-in-law began a relationship, including a sexual one. During this time, they used to meet in motels. These encounters were common among the lovers, always behind Jéssica's back. But both couldn't control the attraction and desire they felt for each other anymore. Célia wanted to separate from her husband, Hamilton, with whom she had a couple of children, Jéssica and Rená, who was 12 years old at the time. One day, Célia's son caught his mother and his brother-in-law being intimate inside his sister's house, but perhaps being too young, he thought that it would eventually end, and he didn't take it seriously. He asked his mother and brother-in-law to resolve their issues to avoid hurting his father and sister. In a senseless and desperate attempt to deal with the situation, Bruno called his father and asked for help to finance an apartment in Arapongas for the family to live in. However, not only the couple with their baby moved, but also Bruno's mother-in-law, Célia, and his brother-in-law, Rená, joined the move. Since the apartment was too small for a large family, and the tension between Bruno and Célia was escalating, at some point, he decided that it had to end. However, the infatuated mother-in-law didn't accept that. The family ended up returning to Apucarana, where they had lived before, and the separated mother-in-law, not giving up, continued visiting her daughter's house, supposedly to help with the little girl. The conclusion was that the two resumed their relationship. During this time, Jéssica became suspicious of her husband's cold behavior, and they no longer had a marital life. She began to cope with her sadness through food, gaining a significant amount of weight and becoming increasingly depressed and suspicious of his potential infidelity. Finally, one day, due to Bruno's carelessness, who left his computer with the screen open to a messaging application, Jéssica saw a conversation that caught her attention and that she could never have imagined. In those messages, she saw intimate conversations between her husband and her own mother, and in a fit of rage, she had a heated argument and assaulted Célia. Bruno tried to separate them and sided with his lover in the argument. Although she discovered the affair, after some time, whether out of love or fear of exposing the situation, we don't know, Jéssica decided to forgive her husband and mother, and she reconciled with Bruno. It was at this point that Jéssica's days were numbered. Since her mother was infatuated with her son-in-law and being a mature woman at the time, around 48 years old, while he was 26, in a conversation with him, she said, "It would be good if Jéssica didn't exist." Bruno later mentioned this statement in his testimony. From that point on, together, they began planning Jéssica's death. However, Celia didn't want her granddaughter to be present at the time of the crime, and they both started devising the entire plan. The diabolical plan of the lovers began a month before the event. Bruno considered simulating a robbery murder, and he hired a third character for this heinous crime, a man also named Bruno, known as Albino. Albino, however, refused to kill Jéssica with his own hands but agreed to participate in the action by hiding Bruno's blood-stained clothes and taking the couple's car to stage the robbery murder. Since Albino didn't have a revolver, and they couldn't find one, Bruno decided to use a knife to commit the crime. As Bruno and Jéssica occasionally traveled to Paraguay to buy clothing for resale, it was the perfect excuse for their plan. Bruno left his daughter at his mother-in-law's house and went with Jéssica to their home to prepare for the trip. It was on that night that Jéssica's life was cruelly and deliberately cut short. The crime occurred on May 9, 2013, in the couple's home. The police received a call from Bruno, claiming that he had been ambushed by a hooded man while opening the backyard gate to leave in the family's car. According to his account, he and his wife had planned a trip to Paraguay and were leaving in the middle of the night. He said that the intruder forced him to enter the house and tied his hands and feet with cable ties, while his wife was stabbed when she resisted the robbery. Jéssica's body had 25 stab wounds. From the outset, the police did not believe Bruno's version, especially as he had a cut on his hand, which was later discovered to have been caused because, after the crime, he took some tape and tied his own hands and feet. However, in his desperation to call the police and tell his version of the events, he needed to free his hands, and he accidentally cut himself with the same knife he had used in the crime. On the same night as the crime, Bruno was arrested on the spot due to the suspicion of murder. Bruno provided 3 statements to the police. In the first, he told the detective that he and his wife were leaving for Paraguay when their home was invaded by criminals, and his wife was killed for resisting the robbery. The following day, during his second statement, he changed his story and confessed to the crime, claiming that he did it because Jéssica was very jealous, annoying, and always picked fights with him. This new version of the case prompted the police to look for evidence of this motive, as his initial explanation was quite shallow. Through their investigation, they found text messages between the victim's mother and Bruno, which revealed that they had an amorous relationship. About 20 days later, Celia was called in for questioning. She claimed that Bruno forced her into a sexual relationship with him and that she only accepted these conditions to protect her daughter and granddaughter from a potentially violent reaction from her son-in-law. She portrayed her lover as a monster for what he did to her daughter and pretended not to know anything, presenting herself as a victim. The police then shared Celia's version with Bruno, enraged to learn that his lover had accused him entirely of the crime, confessed in a third statement, saying that they were lovers by mutual consent and had been together for about 4 years, deeply in love. He also said that Celia was the one who initially suggested and planned the murder of her own daughter. Throughout the case, some testimonies stood out, as they were from people directly connected to Jéssica. Hamilton, Jéssica's father, claimed to have forgiven his wife's infidelity and believed in her innocence. He thought that Celia would never plan her daughter's murder. He also described her as a shy person, not indifferent or cold as she had been portrayed, and he believed that his son-in-law had an interest in land Celia had inherited from her father and took advantage of her vulnerable state to seduce her. Hamilton, the betrayed husband who always knew that his wife was having an affair with his daughter's husband, forgave his wife without hesitation. Jéssica's brother, who was also aware of his mother's extramarital affair, made similar statements in his testimony, saying that Bruno was entirely responsible for the crime and his mother was seduced by her son-in-law, making her innocent. A close friend of Jéssica gave an interview, stating Jéssica knew about her husband's affair with her mother, and she accepted it out of shame to expose the situation, fearing how her father would react to the news and possibly not withstand the shock. According to the friend, Jéssica suffered in silence. The trial of Bruno and Celia was divided into 2 days and lasted about 24 hours in total. The victim's husband, mother, and Albino, the third person accused of involvement in the robbery-murder staging, were all sentenced. The victim's husband and mother were sentenced to 23 years in prison, while the third accused received a 10-year sentence. Jéssica, unfortunately, was brutally and cold-bloodedly murdered at the age of 22, leaving behind a young daughter who was placed under the care of her paternal grandparents. For friends and other family members of the victim, only the memory of a happy, lively Jéssica with a zest for life remains, a life that was tragically cut short by the person who ironically brought her into the world. Leave your opinion on this case in the comments, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories like this, and don't forget to leave a like. See you in the next video.